In the heart of New Mexico, among lonely mountains, stands the mysterious Sunspot Solar Observatory. In 2018, its employees suddenly disappeared, the complex was sealed off by federal agencies, and officials fell silent. But what is really behind NASA's silence and the drama that turned the scientific town upside down? Today, we will take a step-by-step look at each version and reveal what lies beyond the headlines. Stay tuned. The truth is closer than you think. Take a close look at this inconspicuous peak in New Mexico, where the white tower of the Sunspot Solar Observatory rises among centuries-old trees. The second half of the 20th century was marked by a boom in astronomical projects. Rapidly developing telescopes allowed humanity to look at the sun and see far beyond the limits of the solar system. During those years, a small scientific settlement grew up at the foot of Sacramento Peak, a place where life flowed steadily and was governed by a strict schedule of shifts synchronized with sunrise and sunset. Sunspot became not only an important tool for observing the dynamics of the star, on which life on the entire planet depends, but also a unique example of scientific brotherhood. Specialists and students gathered here to exchange experiences, celebrate discoveries, and discuss anomalies in solar activity and their own ambitions. The observatory was built in the mid-20th century by the United States Air Force. It was not only used for fundamental scientific research, Sunspot played a critical role in monitoring space weather, which was essential for planning rocket launches and military and civilian space technology. Later, the observatory came under the control of the National Science Foundation, but remained a federal institution and part of international research programs. Years passed, personnel changed, but the scientific and quiet life of the observatory continued until one day everything changed. From the very beginning of the Sunspot Observatory's existence, its main role was to conduct advanced observations of our sun and to ensure the stable operation of a variety of applied technologies that depend on solar activity. Sacramento Peak not only allowed the smallest changes on the surface of the sun to be recorded, but was also a crucial part of an early warning system for space weather that could disrupt satellite communications, navigation, and power grids. For decades, experts here worked to identify patterns in solar flares, coronal mass ejections, and other phenomena that directly affect modern infrastructure. The observatory became part of an international data exchange and has repeatedly helped to provide rapid warning of dangerous events that could threaten both commercial and military facilities. Life on Sacramento Peak had its own unique characteristics. Located far from major transportation routes, the observatory served as a magnet for scientists, engineers, observers, and their families, whose daily lives were inextricably linked to the rhythms of scientific shifts and strict observation schedules. The weather often made adjustments to the work, and the habit of checking the atmospheric transparency coefficient became almost a ritual. Each day began with a joint discussion of tasks. The list of experiments was agreed upon between experienced researchers and new students who had arrived from various universities across the country. An important element of the Sunspot atmosphere was a deeply rooted culture of mutual assistance. Newcomers quickly mastered not only scientific methods, but also the everyday aspects of life far from civilization. Neighbors gathered in the evenings for a cup of tea or small celebrations. Children organized bicycle races, and adults discussed the latest achievements in telescopic astronomy and upcoming publications in prestigious journals. Even weather anomalies, sudden hailstorms, gusty winds, and short thunderstorms were perceived here as a normal part of the mountain climate. All-night observations during periods of maximum solar activity held a special place. During such periods, the laboratories did not stop for a minute. Glass panels collected the sun's rays, complex spectrometers worked without interruption, and employees sometimes slept right on folding beds in the equipment rooms. Each flash on the sun was carefully recorded, entered into databases, and discussed by the entire research team. Under such conditions, a true brotherhood of researchers was formed, bound by a common goal and a deep respect for the nature of their work. However, despite the atmosphere of outward calm, internal changes were taking place behind the facade of the research center. Funding was becoming increasingly limited, the infrastructure was deteriorating, and savings had to be made on equipment maintenance. The old-timers noted that with each passing year, it was becoming more difficult to maintain the previous standards of accuracy and regularity. The equipment was becoming obsolete, data security requirements were increasing, and technical staff were often working to exhaustion. Nevertheless, there were no problems that would have led anyone to suspect that one day the observatory would find itself at the center of events that shook the entire country. In the evenings, a thick blue twilight spread outside the windows of the laboratory buildings, making Sunspot feel even more isolated from the rest of the world. It was this isolation, with no one but their colleagues for miles around, that fostered a sense of unity, but at the same time made them particularly wary of any changes to their familiar routine. Year after year, the team lived according to a strict, predictable schedule, unaware that one day their tranquility would be shattered in a completely unexpected way. The lives of the Sunspot Observatory staff were governed by a strict routine, which allowed the scientific process to combine stability with constant progress. Daily planning meetings were an integral part of the schedule, and in the quiet of the morning, when the wooden floor of the main building creaked, the shift supervisor noted the upcoming tasks, and the lab assistants habitually set up the equipment, checking the calibration of the instruments before the new research cycle. For most of the scientists who worked here, Sunspot was not only a place of work, but also a home. Many had to live near the laboratory, in small wooden houses where the only view from the window was the top of the telescope and the edge of the forest. The feeling of remoteness from the outside world gave human contact a special meaning. Long, friendly conversations were held in the evenings, residents exchanged food, and birthdays or professional holidays were celebrated by the entire community, which is how the unique atmosphere of a secluded scientific town was formed. Family life was combined with working conditions that were not always easy. The mountain climate was changeable. Frequent fogs interfered with observations, and sudden storms and showers could damage equipment. At such times, engineers worked without sleep to preserve the results of their experiments and prevent the loss of data obtained during a day of intense work. A special place in every scientist's home was reserved for notebooks, where not only instrument readings were carefully recorded, but also personal reflections, hypotheses, and rituals that arose from years of observation. The children of the employees lived as if in another world. There was no city noise, intrusive advertising, or the pervasive internet. The children's scientific curiosity was satisfied by their parents' stories about solar flares, the night sky over Sacramento Peak, and excursions to the telescope tower. Much was decided by a self-supporting community where adults shared their experience and teenagers learned independence by helping with household chores and weather observations. Despite its isolation, the connection with the outside world was excellent. Researchers from other countries regularly visited. Students came for internships, and reports were sent to major academic centers. A small museum of the history of astronomy was also an important feature, where visitors could learn about the achievements of Sunspot employees, find out about methods of observing solar activity, and marvel at the technical details of how the telescopes worked. The employees were proud of their traditions, annual scientific conferences, various projects to reconstruct archival data, and attention to safety issues. The more mundane activities were not forgotten either. After difficult shifts, sports competitions were held, followed by warm dinners at a common table. The main asset was mutual trust. Thanks to this, the team was able to overcome any difficulties and remain motivated to search for new insights into solar dynamics. Over time, the idea took root in people's minds that, despite all the charms and difficulties of life in isolation, it was here, far from the city, that truly original answers to questions about the structure of the cosmos could be found. The scientific truths that emerged from these small laboratories changed our understanding of the very nature of the star around which our entire planet revolves. However, even in this almost idyllic world of scientific routine, subtle signs of something unusual, imperceptible at first glance, appeared from time to time. It all started with minor technical glitches that were not given much attention at first. Sometimes the software malfunctioned, unusual errors suddenly appeared in electronic records, and short power outages were periodically recorded. It seemed that everything could be explained by outdated equipment and unexpected weather conditions, but these little things added up to an uneasy feeling. Subsequently, employees began to notice strange things on the observatory grounds. In the middle of the night, there were occasional strange noises, the clanging of metal, uncharacteristic of the wind, or the disjointed buzzing of machinery. At first, no one said anything about it. Everyone attributed the problems to natural causes. However, when someone began to find strange marks on the grounds, resembling boot prints or fresh dents in the wet earth, curiosity turned to concern. Those who were concerned about the safety of the team were particularly alarmed by the sudden breakdown of the security systems. Such incidents were recorded in the logs, and the employees responsible were required to report anything suspicious to the observatory's headquarters. In those days, there were rumors that someone had seen figures moving in the darkness around the perimeter of the buildings, although none of these sightings were officially confirmed in the logs. At a general meeting, when the shift supervisor tried to ease the tension, people seriously discussed the possibility of intruders. Some suggested that they could be wild animals, while others blamed local teenagers or random tourists. However, deep down, many already understood that the recent events were too well organized to be just a coincidence. During that period, the team split into two groups. The more experienced scientists and technical staff argued that such problems were common at remote sites and could be explained by a combination of outdated equipment, old communications, and natural factors. Young people and newcomers, on the other hand, noticed that the malfunctions began to occur with striking regularity, and the unusual activity around the laboratories began to turn into a persistent sense of unease. With each passing day, the atmosphere of caution only grew. In the evenings, people stopped walking alone, and children only went outside when accompanied by adults. At night, the laboratory windows were not lit unless necessary, and security guards kept a close eye on any suspicious activity. Over time, some of the staff even began to keep personal diaries, recording any deviations from the norm. Thus, a new culture of internal observation and self-analysis was born. This invisible backdrop became the starting point for change. Against a backdrop of growing anxiety, the team continued to work, but questions began to arise more and more frequently in conversations. Could an incident occur here that would upset the balance of Sunspot's familiar world? No one then suspected that the answers would come unexpectedly and abruptly, on the day when the observatory found itself at the center of a loud scandal and everyone disappeared literally overnight. The day the observatory closed was the line that crossed out the normal life of the Sunspot team. It all happened unexpectedly and almost instantly. At the start of another work week, the employees came to their labs as usual, but at the entrance, they were met by people in official uniforms who told them not to enter the buildings and to leave the premises immediately. This laconic order was not accompanied by any explanation. The familiar routine disappeared instantly, replaced by a feeling of oppression and a sense that all the usual norms had been violated. According to eyewitnesses, people were led out in an orderly manner, without unnecessary words, and were not given the opportunity to ask questions or seek clarification. In the rush, many had to leave their personal belongings and unfinished reports behind, while their most valuable files remained on office computers. The atmosphere on site was tense. There was an unusual hum created by trucks arriving for the rapid evacuation of equipment. Some tried to call their superiors or colleagues from other research centers, but the phone lines were intermittent. From the very first minutes, it became clear that this was not a routine malfunction, but an event unprecedented in the history of Sunspot. An official notification, which employees received later by email, stated that the observatory was temporarily suspending operations due to the need for maintenance and risk mitigation. The document was extremely formal, with no mention of the closure date or the reasons behind it. Those who tried to enter the site in the following days were met with locked gates, increased security, and strict secrecy. Security guards strictly prohibited photography, even from nearby trails, and local police refused to comment, citing official secrecy. Parallel to the closure of the observatory, a small village where scientists and their families lived also ceased to exist. Within hours, people were forced to leave their homes, taking only the bare necessities with them. The school, shop, and utilities came to a standstill, and the streets were deserted. Only a few security vehicles and trucks carrying boxes of equipment and documents remained. A few hours after the events, some residents of nearby Cloudcroft noticed convoys of vehicles, further reinforcing the theory of an urgent, pre-planned operation. During the first 24 hours, no one was able to obtain an official comment from the National Science Foundation, and it proved impossible to contact NASA representatives who oversaw a number of projects at Sacramento Peak. Press secretaries for both agencies either referred inquiries to each other or cited internal investigation protocol. All that remained were fragmentary rumors and a tense atmosphere of complete uncertainty. For the Sunspot team and local residents, it was a shock. In the entire history of the observatory, there had never been such a sudden and mysterious evacuation. As news of the closure spread, journalists, bloggers, and curious tourists began to flock to the area. However, security guards stood outside the perimeter, and people in plain clothes patrolled the area, which only fueled interest in what had happened. Local newspapers were soon filled with semi-official versions of events, and social media began to spread the most daring speculations about the reasons behind what had happened. The impenetrable silence of the official authorities only reinforced the mystical aura surrounding the observatory, and the day of its closure became a symbol of suddenness, shock, and the beginning of a major investigation that would soon engulf not only New Mexico, but the entire country. The emotional response to the sudden closure of Sunspot was almost immediate, both among employees and within the local community. Faced with complete uncertainty, many were forced not only to leave their familiar workplaces, but also, in a matter of hours, lost their homes, access to their belongings, and even their credit cards, which had been left in office safes. People who had lived together for many years found themselves scattered across different cities overnight. Some families found temporary shelter with friends or in rented apartments in nearby cities, while others were forced to sleep in their cars. The observatory's management issued a public statement that was vague and did not reveal the actual reason for the evacuation. Employees shared fragmentary information. Some spoke of mysterious people in uniform who coordinated the evacuation, while others recalled unusual noises and unmarked trucks flashing by the site. Some employees were convinced that helicopters were circling the observatory at that time. The sound of rotors was clearly audible, although no one managed to capture them on camera. Several researchers who declined to give their names later mentioned that they had been asked to sign non-disclosure agreements. For residents of nearby villages, this event came as a real shock. Sunspot and those who worked there were part of local life. Just a few days earlier, people had been discussing the weather or the latest successes in observations. And the next day, there was no trace left of the scientific town. The mysterious disappearance of the observatory sparked a wave of rumors, with dozens of versions appearing in local public forums, ranging from dangerous substance leaks to extraterrestrial incidents. No one could obtain reliable information from reputable scientific or government sources, which led to the emergence of a separate culture of interpretations surrounding the entire incident. According to some eyewitnesses, strangers in plain clothes appeared on the observatory grounds alongside official personnel. Their task, apparently, was to study the premises and remove parts of the equipment. Local entrepreneurs who supplied provisions and maintained the infrastructure lost their main source of income almost instantly. During the first weeks after the evacuation, everything around Sunspot seemed frozen, devoid of its former meaning, and filled with an atmosphere of unease. Over the following days, many former employees tried to understand what exactly had caused such urgent measures. They communicated remotely via secure channels and personal messengers. Some shared their guesses. Some believed it was a technical accident. Others spoke of cyber attacks or leaks of sensitive data. And still others hinted at a biological threat. But the main thing was that no one provided any confirmed facts. The state of uncertainty and tense anticipation of the official truth only intensified. Meanwhile, for many, it became a personal drama. Some could not even return for their pets. For others, the loss of access to laboratory data meant the disruption of years of research and scholarships. The only way to adapt to the new conditions was to communicate with each other, support each other, and gather any inside information about the reasons for and prospects of the closure. This turned from a purely professional crisis into a real crisis of social identity, which is still relevant today. Almost immediately after Sunspot's evacuation, the first headlines about this mysterious event appeared in local and federal media. Most major news agencies refer to the only confirmation, an official statement about technical problems, but questions about the real motives behind such an unprecedented move are increasingly being asked. Special correspondents traveled to Sunspot for their own investigative reporting, but access to the facility remained closed. In the first days after the closure, the number of theories grew steadily. Television discussed stories about possible radiation hazards, and popular internet forums were ablaze with discussions about the threat of cyber terrorism. Many local residents claimed that military helicopters were seen on the day of the evacuation, and journalists analyzed their flight paths, but no official statements were ever made. Theories quickly emerged on social media about the influence of large corporations and even the possible intervention of forces unrelated to Earth science. The situation was further fueled by the fact that neither NASA nor the National Science Foundation agreed on a unified line of commentary. Journalists tried to contact experts in the field of astronomy to get alternative assessments of what had happened. However, those who agreed to be interviewed were extremely cautious. Most either cited ignorance or preferred to remain silent. Some experts expressed the opinion that this kind of evacuation could only have been caused by a very serious threat, whether it was the disclosure of particularly important data, the danger of biological contamination, or a leak of information of federal significance. The number of online conferences and streams dedicated to the Sunspot mystery increased several times over. Dozens of videos were posted on YouTube, Twitter, and Telegram, analyzing every hint of detail, no matter how small. In a matter of days, a separate media universe with its own laws of rumor propagation formed around the topic. Local bloggers made videos of abandoned Sunspot buildings, focusing on details such as abandoned shoes, punctured tires, and truck tire tracks. Rumors spread particularly actively about the involvement not only of federal agencies, but also of private contractors. A number of publications claimed that a few days before the events, faulty scientific information allegedly related to the analysis of solar flares had been leaked online. In the absence of official information, any hint of detail was taken by the audience as the truth. Meanwhile, the area around the observatory seemed to have been deserted. The roads were empty, security was noticeably increased, and local residents expressed concerns about mysterious visits by strangers. While some believed that these were merely precautions or the result of a major study, others accused the authorities of withholding information, exacerbating the general information vacuum and atmosphere of distrust. The moment when federal authorities arrived in Sunspot and aircraft appeared in the sky became a new starting point for a multitude of rumors and hypotheses. Official sources insisted that everything that was happening was related exclusively to technical security and the investigation of internal violations. Nevertheless, it was the appearance of helicopters, unusual in type and equipment according to local residents, that sparked a surge of interest comparable only to theories of an alien invasion or the appearance of dangerous materials at a secret facility. Eyewitnesses claimed to have heard the hum of military helicopters before dawn. Some even managed to record silhouettes of the aircraft on their mobile phones as they hovered over the main complex and then flew off toward the wooded area of Sacramento Peak. The scene resembled a targeted operation, vehicles moving around the perimeter, groups of people in identical uniforms, equipment being carried out of buildings and loaded into vehicles. What was particularly alarming was that none of the recordings were seen by the general public. Some videos were quickly deleted, while others became the subject of a separate investigation. Meanwhile, internal tensions were growing. Former employees tried to contact management, but their appeals were either ignored or met with references to the need for confidentiality. There were reports that control groups had appeared on nearby roads, prohibiting unauthorized traffic, and at certain times of the day, even residents of neighboring towns were not allowed to enter the area. At the same time, law enforcement officials politely but insistently asked people not to cause a commotion or spread rumors. At the same time, information was circulating within the Sunspot scientific community about strange checks that had been carried out just days before the evacuation. Some researchers claimed that federal agency employees had checked servers, video surveillance archives, and scientific databases. There was talk that the reason was a leak of astronomical observations obtained from the complex's main telescopes, but no official information about such incidents appeared. Within the media and social networks, the topic of military helicopters became one of the most discussed. Local radio stations aired theories about the possible transport of dangerous materials. Some insiders hinted at training exercises by MARSOC, the U.S. Marine Corps Special Operations Command, while others linked everything to the sudden appearance of spy technology. Every piece of new information was immediately dissected on Reddit, themed posts appeared on 4chan, and Facebook communities argued about real and fictional details. As a result, the actual role of the security forces and the involvement of the Air Force remained unclear. Towards the end of the week, federal officials issued their only clear statement. Everything happening in Sunspot was under federal jurisdiction and part of standard measures to respond to a domestic threat. But what was this threat? No one ever explained. Each new fact only fueled rumors and added to the anxiety of the scientific community, residents, and even journalists who were already accustomed to speculation on provocative topics. Amid this information uncertainty, all officials insisted on the technical nature of the closure and referred to internal security regulations for federal facilities. Brief statements were accompanied by universal phrases about how, in the event of a threat or unusual situations, any observatory is required to temporarily suspend operations to prevent possible negative consequences. Local officials reported that they were in constant contact with federal services without providing any specific details. The focal point of the new comments was a phrase from a statement by an official representative of the National Science Foundation, made a few days after the evacuation. Given the nature of the investigation, details cannot be disclosed, but at this time, there is no threat to surrounding communities. All actions have been taken in accordance with safety standards. This only sparked a new wave of discussion, as no one confirmed the threat mentioned in the document, and there was no evidence of a technical disaster at the scene. A separate thread in the discussion was devoted to attempts to understand why NASA had not provided any feedback on what was happening at Sunspot. Journalists repeatedly sent official requests to both the federal agency and the press service of the Solar Physics Laboratory, but the responses were either not received or were of a purely formal nature. At press conferences, NASA representatives remained silent, shifting the conversation to successes in new projects and not mentioning Sunspot in a single public statement. Attempts by journalists and former employees to obtain any comment were met with obstacles ranging from lack of communication to categorical refusals. At the same time, representatives of the local sheriff's office admitted in private conversations with reporters, "The FBI has forbidden us to disclose any details. Even to us, the details are classified." This approach sparked a new wave of speculation on social media. Telegram channels and Discord servers were flooded with theories about the lack of transparency of federal agencies and the possible concealment of critical information. Each new element of silence surrounding the story only reinforced the atmosphere of secrecy and confirmed the public's assumption that what happened at Sacramento Peak was particularly important or dangerous. The publication of any document, even a formal official letter, immediately became the subject of heated discussion and a search for hidden meaning. Rare comments on NASA's website or on social media by experts were interpreted as hints about the real reasons or hidden connections. Thus, no statement was able to either confirm or completely dispel the wave of public tension, which only grew as events unfolded. In parallel with the official reports, alternative versions, sometimes seemingly completely fantastical, spread rapidly in the media and public sphere. Some commentators on television and social media promoted the idea that the Sunspot archives contained space images capable of changing humanity's understanding of the universe. See, some bloggers claimed that the closure could have been caused by unidentifiable objects detected in the images. Forums discussed the appearance of so-called anomalies, flashes that, according to some employees, seemed to distort the parameters of the equipment and cause strange interruptions in its operation. Much of the speculation revolved around alleged leaks of classified information. Sunspot was said to be a channel for observing near-Earth space, and one of the employees could have accidentally or intentionally obtained images proving the existence of extraterrestrial life. There were even screenshots of images of some glowing objects, supposedly taken a couple of days before the closure, although their authenticity was highly questionable. Video investigations analyzing every pixel and speculating about the nature of these anomalies gained popularity on YouTube. A number of alternative versions touched on the topic of military developments. Some users believed that elements of secret defense systems could have been temporarily located on the Sunspot site and accidentally caught the telescope's attention. There were also some pretty wild ideas. People talked about possible contact with extraterrestrial intelligence, experiments with atmospheric phenomena, and even an attempt to hide the aftermath of a collision with an unknown meteorite. However, the professional scientific community consistently dismissed such speculation in public comments, emphasizing that any important discoveries or unusual situations are always recorded by international observatories, and data management is routinely monitored by several security services. Officials reiterated that none of the published anomalous photographs had been recognized by the expert community. Nevertheless, rumors continued to circulate and grow in detail, with each new publication making the Sunspot story more mysterious and multi-layered. Alternative versions gained their own followers. Entire groups of investigators were created on forums, exposé streams were held, and long posts were written analyzing every nuance of the federal agent's behavior. Among the local population, a conviction grew that no one would tell the truth, and that the truth would remain hidden behind the bureaucratic language of official press releases and the silence of major scientific institutions. The most sensational theories were debunked by the first wave of journalistic investigations and attempts by independent experts to gain direct access to documents related to Sunspot. Employees of major scientific portals and specialized editorial offices submitted official requests under the Freedom of Information Act. A few weeks later, the first documents began to arrive, most of which contained only standard protocols and safety instructions. The internal documents that were accessed mainly concerned the order of equipment inspections, planned actions in the event of an investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and a list of persons authorized to work with critical data. It was in these materials that the only explanation for the emergency measures that corresponded to the official version was found. Unauthorized access to networks related to space surveillance and satellite communications channels had been detected on one of the computers located in the Sunspot server room. When the anomalies appeared, multi-level protection was activated. The archives themselves were urgently encrypted, and personnel were ordered to immediately stop work and leave the premises for additional checks of the entire system complex. Independent auditors noted that such incidents are strictly regulated by internal protocols. At the slightest suspicion of malicious code being introduced or the possibility of a leak of critical information, such as data on the status of spacecraft, navigation satellites, and service control channels, all federal technical facilities in the United States are required to temporarily suspend operations, evacuate personnel, and isolate equipment until the work is completed. The declassified excerpts from the reports were almost identical to the information officially published several months after the events. Without any sensational details, the connection between the FBI's actions, the appearance of special services, and the evacuation was thus due solely to internal security requirements. Perhaps this is why many experts were so laconic in their statements. No one wanted to voice speculation or step outside their official instructions. Theories about biological threats, alien invasion, or a radiation accident, which were actively discussed in the first weeks, were deemed unreliable and rejected after the publication of reports by the National Science Foundation. Details about the specific nature of the threat remained classified, but most independent experts were inclined to believe that the Emergency Response Initiative originated in Washington and was motivated solely by the priority of protecting strategic information and reducing the risk to government communications. As the territory was cleared of suspicious equipment and inspections were carried out, some employees returned to work, but the former atmosphere of trust and sincere scientific enthusiasm never returned. Meanwhile, the public perception that the secrecy surrounding the incident was more a precautionary measure than the result of some grand discovery became firmly entrenched. All further questions related to the leaks were met with the standard response from officials. All information is for official use only and cannot be discussed in public forums. Thus, Sunspot was transformed before our very eyes, from a symbol of scientific cooperation into an example of how strict adherence to bureaucratic procedures can permanently alter the trust between science, the state, and society. The candid comments from the scientific community that followed the official publications and analysis of the situation by independent experts once again highlighted the gap between the general public's perception of the event and the professional view of the incident. Major astronomical organizations and university departments issued a series of statements supporting the security decisions and emphasizing the importance of maintaining control over scientific data transmission channels. The scientific community emphasized that combating cyber threats is becoming an integral part of modern infrastructure, and that federal protocols, albeit strict, protect against more serious problems. Nevertheless, some former Sunspot employees were skeptical about the methods and scale of the response. Behind the scenes, there was discussion about whether the tension surrounding the incident had been exaggerated and whether public secrecy was a cover for someone's failure or bureaucratic error. Those who had previously worked with critical systems noted that it was possible to compromise the work of a large scientific center without external interference. For example, due to inadequate protection of old equipment or excessive centralization of access to data archives. Representatives of alternative scientific fields remained on the sidelines of this discussion. Despite the emergence of convincing official explanations, they tried to maintain their own channels of influence. Comments were published in various communities, suggesting that the real reason, allegedly set out in closed reports, would remain a secret forever. Hashtags about Sunspot continued to circulate on social media, and the discussions took on new nuances. Now there was more debate about the role of the state in the life of research institutions and the degree of transparency in military and civilian interaction procedures. Meanwhile, analysts emphasized that modern science is increasingly dependent on the protection of infrastructure and critical data, and that the secrecy of state institutions can provoke ambiguous reactions both within the professional community and among the general public. Some leading researchers noted that any unpredictable response to emergency situations becomes a catalyst for the growth of conspiracy theories. Even when the cause of events is proven and recognized by most professionals, social media rarely allows the shadow of suspicion to be completely dispelled. Nevertheless, academic discrediting of the most absurd speculations occurred fairly quickly. Major international astronomical societies demonstrated their support for the decision to temporarily suspend Sunspot in official publications, and individual universities initiated cybersecurity lectures for research center staff. It is possible that this case was one of the starting points for reforming emergency response mechanisms to similar incidents in virtually all U.S. government laboratories in the years that followed. The consequences of the Sunspot closure were felt by both the global scientific community and ordinary citizens of New Mexico. The departure of the Astronomical Observation Center left dozens of specialists out of work, deprived students of the opportunity to gain practical knowledge, and destroyed the region's established educational ecosystem. Local small businesses, accustomed to steady demand from observatory staff, faced a sharp decline in revenue. Neighboring shops, hotels, and cafes were forced to either temporarily close or shut down completely. The professional and mental consequences for the scientific community were much more significant. The disappearance of Sunspot was a unique precedent when a scientific program that had been running for decades was almost instantly interrupted in order to prevent a possible threat. Several important projects to observe solar activity had to be put on hold, and the flow of published data was reduced. Some of the archived observations were saved, but many experiments couldn't be repeated because of limited access to unique equipment and software. At the same time, affected employees sought new jobs. Some found work at other research centers in the U.S., some specialists left the country, and some young scientists left astronomy altogether. The local community, previously united by the work of the observatory, experienced a deep human and social crisis. The familiar atmosphere of solidarity was replaced by disunity, and institutions supporting young specialists in the region virtually ceased to operate. At the municipal and national levels, what happened prompted a review of emergency response regulations. Based on the Sunspot experience, new instructions were developed in some departments, data protection standards were improved, and requirements for interaction with external services were tightened. Some of the reforms affected public information processes to prevent such a pronounced vacuum of official information from arising in similar situations in the future. The media paid particular attention to the outcome of these changes, focusing on issues of openness in government science programs and the search for a balance between publicity and security. For New Mexico residents, this episode was a vivid example of how local events can gain national and even international resonance, influencing the development of an entire industry and shaping new ethical and professional standards for scientists, officials, and journalists. The story of the disappearance and closure of the Sunspot Observatory did not end when the lights came back on in the laboratories and some of the staff returned to work. In fact, many questions remained unanswered, both among former employees and in the scientific community, the press, and among local residents. The main ones concerned not only the specific causes of the incident, but also the consequences for the future of the observatory itself, as well as for the work of hundreds of other research facilities around the world. Within the scientific community and on specialized forums, there were detailed discussions about whether the closure of Sunspot would be a starting point for reforms capable of preventing similar incidents at other facilities. New protocols were tested in practice, and special working groups on cybersecurity and interaction with federal services were set up. However, trust once lost between science and the state is difficult and slow to rebuild. For many experts, Sunspot became an example of how security policy can change the very philosophy of scientific research. Instead of openness and data sharing, there is now an emphasis on control, verification, and multi-level isolation. The human factor also remained significant. Even after access to some of the archives was restored, much of the data was lost or incomplete. Scientists continued to argue about who was responsible for the damage: the federal authorities, who acted according to instructions, or the observatory administration, which failed to organize timely backup and encryption. For students and young professionals, this case became a lesson for years to come. In scientific work, it is important not only to make discoveries, but also to be able to protect and store the results of one's work in order to avoid a repeat of such a situation. The issue of the public nature of science occupied a special place in the discussion. The Sunspot precedent showed that any unusual incidents become a catalyst for a wave of conspiracy theories, even if the official explanations are based on facts and documents. In the age of social media and instant communication, it is almost impossible to dispel rumors surrounding any high-profile incident. This has forced some universities and national foundations to rethink their public communication strategies. Open seminars, Q&A sessions, and live broadcasts discussing the realities of working on sensitive scientific objects have become more common. However, even this approach has not completely saved the boundaries between secrecy and openness in the modern scientific sphere from being rethought. Meanwhile, in the village itself, where life once bustled and the laboratory equipment remained on in the evenings, only a few enthusiasts and local residents remained. Some are convinced that the true story of Sunspot's closure will remain in the archives of the federal services and will one day come to light in other publications or in the memoirs of those involved. For others, what happened is a reminder of the fragility of scientific infrastructure which depends not only on nature and technology, but also on national security policy and global processes that go far beyond a single mountain peak in New Mexico. After analyzing the entire chain of events, experts and historians note that the Sunspot episode was a real lesson in humility for modern science. Even the most protected and seemingly insignificant scientific facilities can become hostages to external threats, not only technical, but also political or social. The collective perception of the disaster stimulates the search for new organizational solutions. There is a rethinking of the concepts of open science, public interest, and state secret. Internal audits conducted after the incident showed that many national and international laboratories are not fully prepared for attacks by the human factor, and that centralization of data access makes structures vulnerable, both technically and in terms of reputation. At the same time, efforts are being stepped up to develop new educational programs for specialists at all levels. Some universities have launched new courses on cybersecurity and science, and specialized journals are dedicating issues to real-life emergencies in order to analyze mistakes and successes with maximum transparency. Interim verification formats are emerging. Independent commissions, public councils, and monitoring groups of students and practitioners tasked with ensuring transparency and technical preparedness even in the most remote laboratories. Summarizing the experience of Sunspot's closure, both the strengths and weaknesses of the response, industry analysts emphasize the role of sustainable communication within scientific communities. It is open dialogue between researchers, administrators, and the state that will help reduce the risk of any incident turning into a public scandal. The observatory precedent has led to the emergence of new ethical frameworks: how administrators should act in a crisis, who is responsible for informing the public, and how to filter and refute blatantly false reports in a timely manner. In these matters, Sunspot has become a laboratory not only for astronomy, but also for the sociology of communication. Against the backdrop of historians' analysis, secondary questions are also emerging. What is the future of such remote scientific facilities? And will they be able to survive in an era of big data centralization and mass artificial intelligence? Some experts are convinced that only a combination of technical modernization and the strengthening of a culture of trust within the community will give us a chance to avoid new crises. Sunspot is an example of how a single episode can trigger profound reforms and become a central topic of discussion for many years to come in a variety of professional fields, from cybernetics to journalism. Years after the incident, Sunspot remains a symbol for the scientific world of the fine line between discovery and secrecy, between the enthusiasm for knowledge and the demands of national security. The reaction to the events in New Mexico taught astronomers, engineers, journalists, and students a lot about how to protect their projects, how to build trust, and how to strike a delicate balance between public interest and security. In retrospect, some of the steps taken by those involved seem controversial or overly cautious, but it was precisely this caution that ensured that no direct harm was done to the public good. The story of the team's disappearance, the wave of evacuations, the press conferences, the anxious nights without official information, all of this has become part of the professional annals, a chronicle of human vulnerability and a testament to the strength of institutional protection mechanisms. Sunspot has been mentioned more than once in textbooks and research on risk management. In modern international documents, it is seen as an example of a perfect storm, a situation where all possible factors came together and where decisions had to be made under pressure and uncertainty. However, even today, individual research groups continue to work at the foot of Sacramento Peak. Infrastructure is slowly being restored, and new startups and educational projects are emerging. A few old-timers tell new students about the time when the observatory disappeared from the country's radar. There is little mysticism in these stories, but there is a lot of respect for science and human perseverance. The truth about Sunspot may remain in internal archives, but the main lesson is clear to everyone. It is important to be prepared to defend knowledge in any situation, regardless of the scale of the threat and the depth of the unknown. And as new generations of researchers look through the freshly polished lenses of solar telescopes at the sky above New Mexico, the Sunspot experience reminds the world that even the most established institutions can disappear overnight, only to return in a renewed and perhaps more secure state. The story of Sunspot is one of trust lost and regained, of grappling with the unknown and constantly seeking a balance between the right to know and the duty to protect what makes science great.